Hey guys, tonight we're sailing into the smoky, salt-bitten, wool-scratchy, mead-soaked, fish-perfumed, occasionally, on fire world of the Vikings. A people so famous for swinging axes that everyone forgot 90% of them spent their entire lives quietly arguing with their neighbors about who owned the goat. We're going to spend the next few hours wandering through nearly 3 centuries of farms, fjords, longships, law courts, market stalls, and the occasional spectacularly bad decision. By the end of it, you will have raided a monastery, attended a funeral, gotten lost in Greenland, and had to sit through a long, legally binding argument about a fence, which, fair warning, is somehow the most terrifying part of the whole thing. Before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me which Viking job you'd take: raider, farmer, trader, or the unlucky person who has to clean the longship after a storm. Now, dim the lights, switch on a fan for that gentle white noise, and get comfortable. Picture a low fire smoldering in a longhouse hearth, smoke curling up through a hole in the thatch, and somewhere outside, a sheep complaining about absolutely nothing. Let's pause for a moment. Have you ever wondered what a Viking actually smelled like up close after 3 weeks at sea, in a wool tunic that has not been off his body once? Have you ever wondered what they ate for breakfast, and whether they enjoyed it, or whether they just resigned themselves to it, the way you resign yourself to airport coffee? Have you ever wondered how someone with no map, no compass, and no real sense of where North America was, nevertheless managed to find it, settle there briefly, get into an argument, and leave? Have you ever wondered what they did when they couldn't sleep, when the longhouse was full of snoring relatives and a pig had wandered in for warmth? Have you ever wondered whether they knew, somewhere in the back of their minds, that the era they were living in would one day be called an age, capital A, or whether they just thought of it as Tuesday? And finally, have you ever wondered what it would feel like to die in a society where the afterlife was guaranteed to be either a banquet hall or a damp afterworld run by a woman whose name literally means hidden, and there was, frankly, no in-between? Congratulations. You've just woken up in the year 820 in a coastal village somewhere along the western edge of what will eventually be called Norway. The air smells like wet wool, wood smoke, and the faint, ever-present tang of fish that has been hung up to dry on a wooden frame outside the door. Somewhere very close, a rooster is making a sound that is technically a crow, but feels more like a personal accusation. You're lying on a wooden bench padded with straw, under a wool blanket that is somehow both too warm and not warm enough, and there's a small dog asleep on your feet. Welcome to the Viking Age. It's going to be a long one. Let's set the scene. The longhouse is one long, narrow, smoky room with a packed earth floor and a row of fire pits running down the middle. And the moment you sit up, you realize that everything in your life from this point forward is going to take place under approximately the same roof. There is no privacy. There is no separate kitchen. There's no bathroom in any sense that you would recognize. There is a hole in the roof, technically, for the smoke to escape through. But the smoke seems to have decided it would rather just hang around at face level for the entire winter. You blink. The smoke blinks back. Around you, the household is already awake. And the household, you are learning quickly, is a much larger concept than you are used to. There's the farmer and his wife. There are their 3 children. There are 2 unmarried aunts. There's an elderly uncle who is technically blind in one eye, but absolutely refuses to acknowledge this. There is a thrall. That's an enslaved person. And we'll get to that uncomfortable subject in due course. Who is already up, raking ash from the hearth and pretending not to listen to the family argument about whether the goat got into the grain store again. The goat, for the record, is also in the longhouse and is making no effort to deny it. In one corner, 2 cows are chewing in that slow, philosophical way cows do, separated from the humans by a low wooden partition that is much more symbolic than structural. You can feel the heat coming off them. This, you realize with a kind of horrified fascination, is intentional. The animals are heating the house. You are sleeping next to your own central heating system. And your central heating system has digestive issues. The walls are made of timber, sometimes with wattle and daub between the beams, sometimes with stones at the base. The roof is thatched. There are no chimneys. There are no windows in the modern sense, just small openings that can be shuttered against the cold, which means that for most of the winter, the longhouse is dark in a way that you cannot really comprehend until you're inside one. You light your way with small clay or soapstone lamps full of fish oil, which produce a flame the size of a fingernail, and a smell that lingers in your beard for the rest of your natural life. You take a deep breath, which you immediately regret, because the air is 40% wood smoke, 30% fish, 20% damp wool, and 10% goat. And honestly, in the Viking world, that counts as fresh, breathable, life-affirming, almost luxurious air. Let's talk about who's in charge, because Viking society is not the chaotic, every man for himself bloodbath that movies have promised you. It's actually distressingly bureaucratic. The highest rank in the village is the Jarl, which is a title that roughly translates to Earl, but with more livestock. The Jarl owns the most land, has the largest hall, the most thralls, the most gold rings on his arms. And yes, the rings are a measurable form of wealth, basically a wearable bank account. And yes, you can in fact be paid for your loyalty in literal slices of arm jewelry. The Jarl is also the one expected to hold feasts, settle disputes, and lead any military adventures, which means his job is approximately 70% throwing parties and 30% talking people out of stabbing each other. It's a lot like being a wedding planner with a sword. Below the Jarl is the Carl, the free farmer class, which is most likely what you are. You own your own land, or you rent it from someone slightly richer. You have rights. You have a voice in the local assembly. You can carry a weapon. You can divorce your spouse. And we'll come back to that. You are nobody's property, and you are required, on certain summer days, to attend something called a thing, which is not a vague gesture, but the actual name of the legal assembly. The fact that the most important institution in your life is called a thing is, you suspect, a clue about how seriously these people take linguistic flourish. Below the Carl is the thrall, which is the term for an enslaved person, and there is no way to make this part light, because Viking society, like nearly every pre-modern society, ran in part on the labor of people who had no choice in the matter. Thralls were captured in raids, bought in markets, born into the status, or ended up there because of unpaid debts. They did the heaviest work: milking, hauling, grinding grain, cleaning out the byres where the animals slept. They could, sometimes, earn or be granted their freedom, and there are stories of thralls becoming free farmers with land of their own. But this was the exception, not the rule. The cheerful Viking world of horns and feasts is propped up, in part, by people who never sat at the high seat and were never invited to. Above the Jarl, in theory, is the king, but Viking kingship is a strange and slippery thing. For most of the early period, there is no single king of Norway, or Denmark, or Sweden. There are many small kings, each ruling a region, each constantly negotiating, fighting, marrying off daughters, and trying not to be assassinated by a cousin. The idea of a unified kingdom comes slowly and painfully. And we'll get there, eventually, when we talk about Harold Fairhair and his vow not to cut his hair until he had brought all of Norway under his rule, which, judging by the surviving descriptions, he probably should have rethought. For now, in your village, the man in charge is a stocky, red-bearded jarl named Bjarni, and we'll be coming back to Bjarni a lot, so settle in. Bjarni has 3 sheepdogs, a slightly judgmental wife named Astrid, and a bad habit of starting feasts in the afternoon and ending them 3 days later in the next village over. He is, by all accounts, a good leader, which in Viking terms means he is fair, generous with his ale, and only occasionally murderous. In the end, the Viking world is hierarchical, but it's not quite the rigid hierarchy you'd expect. People move up. People fall down. A landless man who joins a successful raid and comes back with silver can buy a farm. A jarl whose decisions go badly can find himself overruled by the local assembly. The system has given it. It's like a wooden ship. It creaks, it bends, it occasionally takes on water, but somehow, against all odds, it stays afloat. Let's talk about the thing, because if you remember nothing else about the Vikings, you should remember that these supposedly bloodthirsty raiders had what was, for the time, an extraordinarily structured legal system, and they took it very, very seriously. The thing was a regular assembly held outdoors, usually in spring or summer, where free men gathered to settle disputes, pass laws, hear cases, and make decisions about the community. There was a designated law speaker, a man who had memorized the entire body of law and recited it aloud over the course of 3 days, because writing it down was considered, at this stage, slightly cheating. Imagine a man whose job is to be a walking, talking, legal code. Imagine the pressure on him, not to cough at the wrong moment. You are required, as a free man, to attend. You travel, sometimes for days, to reach the Thingstead, which is usually a flat, open piece of land with some kind of natural amphitheater, a slope, a circle of stones, a hill people can sit on. There are tents pitched everywhere. There is a market. There is, inevitably, a great deal of drinking. There are also, somewhere in the middle of all this, actual legal proceedings, which proceed at a stately, mind-numbing pace, because every case is heard, every witness is questioned, and every grievance is aired in detail. If your neighbor's cow ate your hay, you can bring a case. If your cousin called your mother a name in the mead hall, you can bring a case. If someone has stolen your sheep, you can absolutely bring a case, and the court will deliberate, and there will be witnesses, and there will be oaths, and the whole village will spend 3 days arguing about a sheep. The genius of this system, and it is, in its own strange way, genius, is that it gave people a place to take their grievances besides the end of an axe. The blood feud, the cycle of revenge killings, was the great destabilizing force in Viking society, and the thing was the institution that sometimes broke the cycle. A killing could be paid off in silver. An insult could be answered with a fine. A dispute could be ruled on. The ruling could be enforced by the community, and life could go on. Of course, sometimes the thing went badly. Sometimes a man rejected the verdict, walked off, and started a feud anyway. Sometimes the law speaker forgot a clause and the entire village had to wait while he started over. Sometimes 2 parties agreed to settle their dispute by combat instead, which was a perfectly legal option called the holmgang, and which involved the 2 men fighting on a small piece of cloth or a tiny island until one of them either yielded or fell off. Spoiler, this rarely went well for either party. You, as a carl, would attend the thing every year. You'd see the same faces. You'd hear the same arguments. You'd nod along to the law speaker's recitation, which would last for hours, and you'd think about your fields, and you'd vaguely wonder if this is what civilization felt like. And the truth is, yes. Most of it is being slightly bored in a crowd while someone in front explains the rules. In the end, the thing is not glamorous, but it is the quiet machinery underneath everything else. The reason a society of farmers, fishermen, and occasional raiders held together at all. Without it, they're just feuds. With it, there is a thin, wobbly, surprisingly resilient thing called law. And honestly, in the 9th century, that counts as a triumph. Let's talk about who you live with, because the longhouse is full, and the cast list is frankly a lot. Bjarni the Jarl, you've already met, the red-bearded man with the dogs and the questionable feast schedule. His wife Astrid is a tall, sharp-eyed woman who runs the household with a quiet competence that everyone, including Bjarni, finds slightly intimidating. She wears a set of keys at her belt, and the keys are not just practical, they're a status symbol, the visible mark of a married woman who controls the household stores. She is the reason the cheese is good, and the woolen goods are well made, and the visitors always feel welcome. And she is also, when necessary, the reason a thrall who has been mistreating a child suddenly finds himself reassigned to the most miserable job in the steading. There's old Sigurd, who is technically retired, but cannot be persuaded to stop fixing things. He spends most of his day on a bench by the door, whittling small wooden objects whose purpose is unclear, occasionally announcing that he can feel a storm coming in his knee. He is correct about the storm 50% of the time, which is, statistically, exactly chance. But no one points this out, because Sigurd has buried 2 wives and 4 children and earned the right to predict whatever weather he likes. There's Ingrid, a teenage girl who is, by your rough estimate, the most competent person in the entire village. She can spin, weave, milk, churn, ride a horse, navigate by the stars, cook, mend, gut a fish in under 10 seconds, and identify 3 different kinds of edible seaweed. She is engaged to a young man from the next valley over, and she speaks of him with the careful, slightly amused tone of a person who has decided to like him, but is reserving the right to revise her opinion. There's toothless Egil. And yes, there's always a toothless eagle, who lost most of his teeth to a combination of bad luck and one particularly poor decision involving a frozen apple, but who nonetheless eats absolutely everything that is put in front of him with the enthusiasm of a much younger man. Egil is your traveling companion. Egil is the one who will take you out on the boat, show you how to mend a net, and tell you, with great relish, the story of the time he saw a whale up close, which was more terrifying than he is prepared to admit. And there's Ravensoul, the household dog. Yes, named Ravensoul, because Vikings did not believe in restraint when it came to naming things, who is large, gray, and so unbothered by human affairs that you sometimes wonder if he is actually a small, wise philosopher in a very convincing dog suit. Ravensoul will appear in many of these chapters. Ravensoul does not care. There's a cat too, no name, just the cat, who keeps the rats down and considers the longhouse, the byre, and approximately 3 nearby farms to be her personal territory. The cat is, by Viking standards, an aristocrat. The Vikings buried important women with cats sometimes. They knew what they had. Together, this is your community for the rest of the script. You'll see them in the fields, on the boats, at feasts, and on long winter nights. You'll learn that Astrid never panics, that Ingrid is right about most things, that Egil's stories get longer every year, and that Ravensoul has, somehow, accidentally become your best friend. In the end, the longhouse is loud and crowded and smells strongly of human and animal life, but it is also, in its own way, a kind of family. And in a world this dark, this cold, this prone to sudden violence, family is the thing that keeps you alive. Let's talk about the day, because the Viking day is structured in a way you will find both exhausting and oddly soothing once you settle into it. There is no clock. There are no bells. There is the sun, and in the long northern winter, the sun is more of a polite suggestion than a reliable presence. You wake when it is light enough to see, which in February might be 10 in the morning, and you stop working when it is too dark to see, which might be 3 in the afternoon. The summer is the inverse. The sun barely sets, and the work expands to fill all of it. You will plow at midnight. You will mow hay at 1 in the morning. You will look up from a field and realize, with a kind of dazed horror, that it has been daylight for 36 hours, and you are not entirely sure when you last slept. In winter, the daily routine is contracted, quiet, and largely indoor. You get up, you stoke the fire, you milk whatever animals need milking, you eat a small breakfast, usually some kind of porridge made from barley or oats, with a smear of butter or some skyer if you are lucky. And then you spend the rest of the daylight hours doing whatever needs doing. The men mend tools, repair boats, work leather, carve wood. The women spin, weave, brew, salt fish, and run the household. Children gather firewood, watch the smaller animals, and develop the kind of 1,000-yard stare that comes from being the household's primary goose herder. In summer, everything explodes outward. There is hay to cut, fields to plow, ships to caulk, fish to dry, longships to sail to markets, livestock to move between pastures. The whole community is in motion. You are constantly tired. You are constantly damp. You are constantly being asked to lift something heavy. And yet, there's a rhythm to it, a sense that everyone knows what they are doing and why, and the work, while hard, is the work that has kept this community alive for generations. Meanwhile, around you, the smaller daily rituals tick on regardless of the season. The morning porridge, the midday cheese, the evening meal, the quiet hour after the meal when people sit by the fire and someone, often Eagle, starts a story. The going to bed, which is not a private ritual, but a communal one. Everyone bedding down on the same long benches, the children at the warmer end, the dogs underfoot, the cat refusing to acknowledge any of you. In the end, the Viking day is not glamorous. It is hard and cold and full of small, repetitive labors. But it is also full of a kind of competence that the modern world has lost. The competence of people who know exactly how to do every single thing required to keep themselves alive, and who do those things day after day without ever expecting applause. Let's talk about the food, because Viking food is one of those subjects that sounds, on paper, almost adventurous, and in practice is largely an exercise in chewing things until they yield. You will eat a great deal of porridge made from barley, oats, or rye, sometimes flavored with bits of dried meat or a smear of butter, sometimes flavored only with the slow, sad realization that this is the third bowl this week. The porridge is your friend. The porridge is also, statistically speaking, going to be a load-bearing element of your nutrition until the day you die. You will eat fish. You will eat so much fish that you will start to dream in fish. There is fresh fish in summer when the boats come in. There is salted fish in autumn. There is dried fish in winter, which is essentially a fish-shaped piece of plywood that you have to soak for a day before you can cook it. And even then, it has a quality somewhere between meat and stationary. There is pickled fish, fermented fish, smoked fish, fish stew, and a particularly memorable Norwegian specialty called lutefisk, in which fish is preserved by being soaked in lye, which is the same chemical you'd use to clean a drain. Spoiler: lutefisk has divided opinion in Scandinavia for over 1,000 years and will not be settled in this script. You will eat meat, but not as often as you'd think. Cattle are valuable for their milk and their labor, so you don't slaughter them lightly. Pigs are slaughtered in autumn, and the autumn pig becomes the winter ham, the winter sausage, the winter blood pudding. Sheep give wool first and meat second. Game supplements the diet for those who hunt, but most farmers don't have time. The big communal feasts are where you really eat. The harvest feast, the midwinter feast, the wedding, the funeral. At these, the table groans under the weight of roast meats, fresh bread, butter, cheese, and of course, ale. You will drink ale, and a lot of it. Ale is safer than water, in the sense that the brewing process kills off most of what would otherwise kill you, and it provides calories on top of hydration. You drink it at every meal. The children drink a weaker version. Astrid brews it, and Astrid's ale is, by general agreement, one of the reasons people keep coming back to Bjarne's Hall. Mead, fermented honey, is the drink of feasts, the drink of celebrations, the drink that gets people up to tell long, embarrassing stories about each other. There's also, occasionally, imported wine, which arrives via the trade routes, costs a fortune, and is consumed at very specific occasions with the kind of reverence that people now reserve for fine whiskey. You will eat dairy, lots of it. Skyr, a thick yogurt cheese hybrid that the Icelanders still make today. Cheese, hung in the rafters in cloth bags. Butter, which is sometimes salted, sometimes not, sometimes preserved in barrels buried in the ground for years and dug up later when needed. And yes, that butter is genuinely consumed and described in sagas, which means that somewhere in the Viking diet there is the concept of bog butter, which is exactly what it sounds like. It tastes, by all accounts, like cheese that has visited a basement. People love it, and you will eat bread, dense, dark, occasionally studded with grit from the millstones, a fact that, over the course of a lifetime, will wear your teeth down to the gum line, which is part of why so many older Vikings have such notably worn dentition in the archaeological record. In the end, Viking food is heavy, salty, smoky, and built for survival rather than pleasure. And yet, around the table, with the fire going and the ale flowing, and Egil halfway through a story about the time he caught a halibut, the size of a doorway, the food is more than fuel. It's the thing that holds the day together. It's the thing that means you made it. And honestly, that's good enough. Let's talk about hygiene, because the Vikings have, undeservedly, developed a reputation for being filthy, and it is time to set the record straight. They were not filthy. They were, by the standards of their time, almost weirdly well-groomed. Contemporary Anglo-Saxon writers complained that Viking men were so clean and well-combed that they were seducing English women away from their husbands at an alarming rate. There is a surviving rant from a 12th century English chronicler accusing Vikings of bathing every Saturday, the horror, and combing their hair daily, the indignity. The reality is that the Vikings appear to have invented Saturday as bath day, and the Old Norse word for Saturday, lagerdagar, literally means washing day. Combs are everywhere in Viking archaeology. They turn up in graves, in middens, in shipwrecks, made of antler or bone, often beautifully decorated, often kept in a small case on the belt. People combed lice out of their beards and hair daily, lice being, sadly, a fact of life in any pre-industrial society. They cleaned their ears with small ear spoons. They cleaned their teeth with sticks and fingers. They washed their faces every morning, often using a bowl that was passed around the household, which is less hygienic than you'd hope, but more hygienic than nothing. For bathing, you have a few options. There are natural hot springs in Iceland, and the Icelanders have been bathing in them happily for over 1,000 years. There are bathhouses in some of the larger settlements, modest wooden structures with a hot stone pit that you splash water on to create steam, basically an early sauna. There is the river or the sea, if you are brave and the weather permits. And there is the bowl and cloth approach, which is the one you'll be using most often. A small bowl of warm water, a cloth, and the willpower to face your own armpits in February. For the toilet, and there is no delicate way to handle this, you go outside and you go to a small wooden privy, often built over a midden, and you do your business, and you come back in, and you do not think about it, because if you thought about it too much, you would lose your mind. There are also chamber pots used at night, when going outside in the snow with a bear about is not appealing. Children are toilet trained over wooden tubs in the corner of the longhouse, the thrall who has to empty the tubs, has statistically the worst job in the entire community. For health, the Viking world has no antibiotics, no germ theory, no hospitals. What it has is a collection of folk remedies, herbal medicine, and a willingness to try absolutely anything once. Yarrow and meadowsweet for fever, garlic and onion for wounds, and there is some evidence that these actually had antibacterial effect. So the Vikings were inadvertently practicing real medicine without knowing why it worked. Honey for burns and infections, which also has genuine antibacterial properties. Birch bark for pain. There are wise women, and sometimes wise men, in every community who know the local plants and how to use them, and who function as the village's combination: doctor, midwife, therapist, and dispenser of last resort. Childbirth is the most dangerous time in any woman's life. The infant mortality rate is brutal. A child who survives the first year has a reasonable chance of making it to adulthood, but the first year is a coin toss with weighted dice. The Vikings respond to this with a combination of pragmatism and ritual. Children are not formally named until 9 days old, in part because so many of them did not survive the first 9 days. And giving a name to a child you might lose was, in this culture, a step taken cautiously. And yet, despite all this, the average Viking who survived childhood lived a surprisingly long life. There are skeletons in the archaeological record of men and women who lived into their 60s and 70s, who had old injuries that had healed cleanly, who had been cared for through illness and old age. They were tougher than us. They were also, when it mattered, kinder to each other than the stereotype allows. And in a world this hard, kindness is medicine too. Let's talk about clothes, because what you are wearing is going to dictate a surprising amount of your daily existence. You are wearing wool. You are mostly wearing wool. There are layers of linen underneath, if you are lucky, and there is leather on your feet, if you are luckier still. But the bulk of what is keeping you warm is wool, and the wool was sheared off a sheep that you possibly know personally, then washed, combed, spun, woven, dyed, and sewn into a tunic by hands you have eaten dinner with. Every garment is a testimony to months of someone's labor. The basic outfit for a man is a long tunic that comes down to mid-thigh, worn over woolen trousers, sometimes baggy and gathered at the knee, sometimes more fitted. Over the tunic in cold weather, a wool cloak fastened at the shoulder with a brooch, and the brooch is not just functional. It's a status piece, because the more elaborate the brooch, the more you are signaling your wealth and your taste. On the feet, leather shoes, simple, ankle-high, secured with a thong, with the seam often running straight up the front. They will leak. They will always leak. You will spend a noticeable percentage of your life with damp feet, and you will simply make peace with it. The basic outfit for a woman is more elaborate and more visually striking. A long linen underdress, an outer woolen dress that hangs from straps over the shoulders, secured at the chest with 2 large oval brooches. These brooches are iconic. They are the single most recognizable item of Viking women's dress, and they often have strings of beads strung between them, glass and amber and crystal. A married woman wears a head covering, often with the keys at her belt. A wealthy woman has elaborate embroidery, dyed colors, imported silks woven into the trim. The clothes are not drab. Viking dye work used madder for red, woad for blue, weld for yellow, and the surviving textiles, when reconstructed, are vivid in a way that the dusty stereotype completely fails to capture. Children dress like miniature adults. Babies are wrapped in wool. Old people pile on more layers. Everyone, in winter, wears fur, sheepskin, foxskin, even bearskin if you can afford it, because the cold is not metaphorical. The cold is a presence. The cold has opinions about you and is testing them constantly. You also wear, if you are anyone of any standing, a small knife at your belt. Not a weapon so much as a tool, used for everything from eating to whittling to opening sacks of grain. You eat with this knife. You may also have a small leather pouch hanging from the same belt, containing flint and steel, perhaps a comb, perhaps a coin. Pockets have not been invented. Belts are doing the heavy lifting. You may, if you are vain, and the sagas suggest many Vikings absolutely were, also be wearing jewelry. Arm rings, neck rings, finger rings, sometimes earrings, often elaborately decorated with the looping animal designs we mentioned earlier. The looping animals are still here. They are everywhere. They are on your buckle, on your brooch, on the carved bone handle of your knife. You suspect, at this point, that the Vikings simply could not draw an animal without making it bite its own tail. It's a stylistic commitment that you have to admire. In the end, what you are wearing is what you have. There is no closet. There is one good outfit and one work outfit, and you mend them, and you re-sew them, and you eventually pass them on to the next person in the family. The cloak you are wrapped in tonight may have been worn by your grandfather. It is, in its scratchy, smoke-scented, slightly itchy way, a kind of inheritance. And honestly, it's good enough. Let's talk about the Longship, because if there is one object that defines the Viking Age, more than the helmet, more than the axe, more than the horn, that they almost certainly did not put on their helmets, it is the ship. The Viking Longship is one of those rare engineering achievements that is also an aesthetic triumph. Shallow drafted, clinker built, double-ended, capable of crossing open ocean and rowing up a river so shallow you could wade across it. It is, in a very real sense, the technology that made everything else possible. Without the Longship, there is no Viking Age. There is just a slightly grumpy peninsula full of farmers. The construction is the work of months. A keel is laid, a single long timber, ideally cut from one tree, because joins are weak points. Strakes, long planks, are added, each one overlapping the one below it and riveted with iron nails. This is the clinker technique, and it gives the ship its flexibility. A Viking longship flexes in a heavy sea. Modern reconstructions have shown that a Viking ship in a swell looks like a piece of seaweed in motion, bending, twisting, adapting. It is, paradoxically, this flexibility that makes them so seaworthy. The shape is double-ended, meaning bow and stern look more or less the same. High, curved, often topped with a carved dragon's head that can be removed when entering home waters so as not to anger the local land spirits. The mast steps in the middle. There's a single square sail, made of wool reinforced with leather. There are oar holes along the sides. The crew sits on their sea chests, which double as benches. The largest of these ships could carry 60 or more men. The smallest, more modest Nar. The trading ship. Itanirmasjabditin were designed to carry cargo rather than warriors. There were ships for raiding, trading, exploring, fishing, the local market run. The Viking world ran on water, and the ship was the vehicle, the highway, and the moving floor of half the population's lives. Sailing one of these ships is, by your standards, a profoundly uncomfortable experience. There are no cabins. There is no shelter. There is no toilet. You do your business over the side, with a great deal of grim concentration, while a colleague holds your belt. You sleep on the deck under your cloak, or, if you can, you put into a beach for the night. You eat cold food, mostly, because cooking on a wooden ship at sea is the kind of activity that ends entire careers. You are wet. You are tired. You smell like a barrel of pickled fish that has fallen in love with a barrel of unwashed wool. And yet, the longship is the freedom of this entire age. You can go anywhere. You can put a boat in the water, and, with reasonable seamanship and appalling luck, you can be in Iceland in a week, in the Faroes in 3 days, off the coast of Ireland in 5, in the rivers of what is now Russia in a season. The Vikings will reach Constantinople by river, will trade with the Caliphate, will plant a colony in Greenland, will set foot in North America, centuries before Columbus, and then quietly leave, because the locals were not, as it turned out, interested in being neighbors. All of this is possible because of one piece of carefully shaped wood with a sail on it. In the end, the longship is more than a tool. It is the central character of the Viking Age. It is the beautiful, clinker-built reason a small population on the edge of Europe somehow ends up shaping the history of half a continent. And in the songs and the sagas, when a hero dies, he is often laid in his ship and sent to the sea or to the fire, because in this culture, the ship is the soul's last vehicle. It carries you in life. It carries you in death. And honestly, that's a beautiful thing. Let's talk about the raid, because the raid is what everyone thinks of when they think of Vikings, and we need to understand what it actually was, because the reality is messier and more interesting than the legend. The first famous raid is in the year 793 on the monastery of Lindisfarne, off the northeast coast of England. A small group of Vikings, possibly Norwegian, possibly from across the Skagerrak, beach their ship, walk up to a wealthy, undefended religious community, and proceed to take whatever they can carry: gold, silver, books with jeweled covers, sacred relics, and a number of monks who they sell as slaves. Word of this event reaches the rest of Europe, and the rest of Europe loses its mind. Why? Because no one has ever done this before. Not really. Not at this scale. Not from the sea. Not on a holy place. The monasteries of medieval Europe are wealth storage facilities. They have gold, silver, land, and they are, until this moment, considered untouchable, both because of their religious status and because of their isolation. The Vikings have noticed two things: that these wealth piles exist and that they are not protected. From this moment on, until well into the 11th century, raiding will be a recurring feature of European life. The raid as a Viking institution is a specific thing. It's not constant warfare. It is mostly a seasonal activity. Young men, often the second or third sons of farmers, men with no land of their own and limited prospects at home, band together under a leader, build or buy a ship, and head out for the summer raiding season. They hit a coast, take what they can, and come home before winter. The wealth they bring back is converted into silver, used to buy land, used to buy livestock, used to buy a wife, used to buy status. The raid is, in this sense, an economic activity. It is also extraordinarily violent, and the people on the receiving end of it experience it not as an economic activity, but as the worst day of their lives. You should know that not every Viking raids. Most don't. The farmers in the village stay home, work the land, mend the boats, attend the thing. The raiders are a subset, and they are often the same men year after year. Career raiders who have built up reputations, who have lieutenants and crews. Some, over time, become professionals. They hire themselves out as mercenaries, take service with foreign kings, become bodyguards in Constantinople, where they form the famous Varangian Guard, an elite unit of Norse warriors whose job is to protect the Byzantine emperor, and who, by all accounts, take this job extremely seriously. The raid also evolves. By the mid-9th century, the raids are larger, the fleets are bigger, the targets are more ambitious. Whole armies, the great heathen army that lands in England in 865, set up camps, winter over, and begin to demand not just plunder, but tribute, which in turn leads to the Danegeld, the famous pay the Vikings to go away tax, which works the way you'd expect. They go away, they come back, they ask for more. Eventually, the raids become invasions, and the invasions become settlements. In the chaos of this, ordinary Viking farmers, and Bjarni, and Astrid, and the village you live in, are mostly bystanders. They send a son or two to the seasonal raid. They welcome them home. They do not, as a rule, themselves participate in the famous bloodbaths that fill the history books. The history books, like most history books, are written by the people on the receiving end, and they remember the worst days, not the average ones. In the end, the raid is real, and the raid is brutal, but it is one face of a complicated culture. The same hand that swings the axe at Lindisfarne also mends a fishing net, holds a baby, votes at the thing, carves a comb. People are never just one thing, Vikings included. Let's talk about the gods, because the Viking spiritual world is one of the most distinctive and atmospheric in all of human history, and you are going to need to know it if you're going to make it through the script. There are many gods. The two most important groups are the Aesir, the warlike, sky-dwelling gods led by Odin, and the Vanir, the older, fertility and prosperity gods who were eventually merged with the Aesir after a long and somewhat mysterious mythological war. We don't have time to do justice to the entire pantheon, but you will need to know a few key figures. Odin is the All-Father. He is one-eyed because he gave up the other eye for wisdom. He hangs from a tree for 9 days to learn the secret of the runes. He travels disguised as an old man, asking riddles, testing strangers. He is the god of poetry, of war, of magic, of death, of frenzy, of the runes. He has 2 ravens, Hugin, Thought, and Munin, Memory, who fly out every morning and bring back news of the world. He has an 8-legged horse called Sleipnir, whose origin story involves Loki turning into a mare and seducing a stallion, which is the kind of detail you simply have to accept as part of the package. Thor is Odin's son, and Thor is, in a real sense, the everyman's god. Where Odin is for kings and skalds and warriors of high status, Thor is for farmers, sailors, and ordinary men. He is red-bearded, hugely strong, slightly slow on the uptake, a lover of food and ale, a slayer of giants. His hammer, Mjolnir, returns to his hand when thrown. He has a chariot pulled by 2 goats, who he can eat in the evening and resurrect in the morning by laying their bones in their hides, provided no one breaks the bones for the marrow, which once a farmer's son did, leaving Thor to limp through eternity with one slightly lame goat. The detail of the lame goat is the kind of thing that elevates Norse mythology above the others. Frey and Freya are siblings, and they are the gods of fertility, prosperity, love, and certain kinds of seductive magic. Frey is associated with sunshine and good harvests. Freya is associated with everything from gold to cats. Her chariot is pulled by cats, which is why the cat in your longhouse is, technically, a sacred animal. She also receives half of those slain in battle, the other half going to Odin in Valhalla. There is Loki, the trickster, the half-giant, the cause of most of the gods' problems, and occasionally the solution to them. There is Hel, who rules a misty gray underworld for those who don't die in battle. There is Heimdall, the watchman, who can hear grass growing. There is Tyr, the one-handed god of justice. There is Idun, who keeps the apples that grant the gods their youth. You worship these gods through ritual, through sacrifice, through small daily observances. You raise a cup at the feast and call out a name. You leave a bowl of milk for the household spirits. You wear a small Thor's hammer on a thong around your neck. The Thor's hammer pendants are everywhere in Viking-era graves, and they appear to spike in popularity in the late Viking Age, possibly as a deliberate statement against incoming Christianity. You carve runes for protection, for love, for revenge. You consult the wise woman who can read the runes, who can see the future, who can speak with the dead, and looming over all of it is Ragnarok, the end of the world. The wolves that swallow the sun and the moon, the serpent rising from the sea, the fire giant Surt walking out of the south with a flaming sword, the gods themselves dying one after another in a final battle, and after the destruction, a new world rising from the sea, green and good. The Norse cosmos builds in its own ending. The gods know they will die. The world knows it will end, and the heroism is not in preventing this, but in facing it bravely. It is, in its bleak way, a remarkably honest theology. In the end, the gods are not abstractions. They are present. They are noisy. They are fallible. They drink too much. They lose at games. They get tricked. They die, and they get reborn. And in the smoky longhouse on a winter night, when the wind is howling and the fire is low, the stories of the gods are the stories you tell your children, because the stories of the gods are, in the end, the stories of yourselves. Let's talk about women, because the Viking world is one of the few in pre-modern Europe where a woman's legal position was meaningfully better than nothing, and we should give credit where credit is due. A free Viking woman could own property. She could inherit. She could divorce her husband. And the procedure was, by medieval standards, almost shockingly straightforward. She could divorce him for striking her, for failing to provide for her, for being unable to perform his marital duties, for wearing women's clothing, or, in one famous Saga case, for wearing a shirt with too low a neckline. Yes, that was grounds for divorce. The man's neckline was deemed inappropriate. We are not making this up. She could not, in most regions, attend the thing or hold political office. She could not, formally, take part in raids, although there are tantalizing archaeological finds, like the Burka warrior burial, of women buried with full warrior kit, suggesting that the rules were not always strictly enforced. She could not be a chieftain, although she could absolutely be a chieftain's widow and run the household with iron authority until her son came of age, which in practice often meant decades. She controlled the household. The keys at her belt are not metaphor. They are the literal symbol of her domain, which is the longhouse, the storerooms, the dairy, the brewing, the spinning and weaving, the food. A wealthy household is a small economy, and the woman runs that economy. Astrid, our Jarl's wife, is responsible for the survival of dozens of people every winter. She is the person who knows how much grain is left, how much salted fish, how many barrels of butter, how much cloth has been woven, who needs new shoes, who is sick, who has a grievance with whom. She is the operating system of the household. Some women run more than households. Aud the Deep-Minded was a chieftain in her own right, who led a settlement expedition to Iceland after her husband's death and distributed land to her followers. The early Iceland of the sagas is full of formidable women, Bergthora, Halgerd, Gudrun, who hold opinions, settle scores, and shape the action as much as any of the male characters. They are not exceptions in a culture that simply did not expect women to be silent. There are also women in special, ambiguous spiritual roles. The Volva, the seeress, is a wandering wise woman who travels between settlements, performs divinations, communicates with the spirits, and is paid in food and silver. Communities welcome her, fear her slightly, listen to her with care. She wears a distinctive cloak, carries a staff, sits on a high seat during her rituals. She is, in many ways, a survival of an older, pre-Aesir spiritual tradition. There are tradeswomen, brewers, midwives, farmers, weavers whose textiles are so fine they are exported across the Norse world. There are saga heroines who plot and avenge and refuse to be silenced. There are also, of course, ordinary women, most women who lived ordinary lives, raised children, lost children, worked themselves to exhaustion, found small joys in small things, and were not famous and were not written about. Their archaeology, the spindle whorls, the loom weights, the small soapstone lamps, is everywhere. Their voices are mostly lost, but the texture of their world is preserved in every comb, every brooch, every pot of skyer, every length of wool. In the end, the Viking world was not a feminist paradise. It was a hard, patriarchal society where women were valued primarily as wives and mothers, and where a woman's options were profoundly constrained by her circumstances. But within those constraints, there was more agency, more legal recourse, and more genuine respect than in most surrounding cultures. A Viking woman in the year 900 had rights that a Norman woman in the year 1100 would lose and would not regain for nearly 1,000 years. That, in its way, is its own kind of monument. Let's talk about love, because we have spent a long time on raids and laws and food, and we have not yet talked about the warmer, quieter heart of all this. Viking love is not the love of romantic poetry. There is some of that in the later sagas, but the dominant love story of the Viking Age is more practical, more layered, and, in its own way, more enduring. Marriages are arranged in the sense that families negotiate, but the bride and groom Both have a meaningful say. Either party can refuse. Either party can divorce. The marriage is, fundamentally, an economic and social partnership, and both partners are expected to bring something to it: land, livestock, skill, status, kin connections. The wedding itself is a multi-day affair. There is feasting. There are ritual exchanges of swords and keys, the sword from her family to his, signaling her family's trust, the keys from him to her, signaling her authority over the new household. There is mead, and there is dancing, and there is, at some point, the formal procession to the bedchamber, where the marriage is consummated under a great deal of ceremonial witnessing. After the wedding, the work begins. You wake up next to each other every morning in the longhouse, and you build a life. You raise children. You weather hard winters. You bury parents. You bury, sometimes, children. You have possibly deep affection for each other. You have possibly mutual respect that deepens into something more. You have possibly a polite tolerance that lasts 40 years. The sagas are full of marriages of all these kinds, and the sagas are remarkably honest about the unromantic ones. There are sagas where the husband and wife clearly cannot stand each other but stay together, because the alternative is logistically inconvenient. There are sagas where they love each other deeply, where the death of one is the death of the other, where in the funeral ship they are laid together because nothing else makes sense. Outside marriage, there is also love. There are friendships that the sagas describe in tones we would now reserve for romance. The great, oath-bound friendships between warriors, the foster-brother bonds, the ride-or-die loyalty between companions that runs deeper than family. There are cousin pairs, generation pairs, hall friends. There are children of different households fostered together, sent away to be raised by another family. And the bond of fosterage is considered, in some ways, even stronger than the bond of blood. You have a foster brother somewhere, possibly. You may not have seen him in years, but if his enemies came knocking, you would ride out, and he, somewhere, would do the same for you. Their romantic affairs, complicated ones, scandalous ones. There are abductions, elopements, secret meetings in the hay meadow. There is at least one famous saga in which a man learns to play the harp, composes love songs in secret, and serenades his beloved through the wall of her father's longhouse for an entire winter. The father eventually relents. The harp, presumably, gets played at the wedding, and there is grief. There is so much grief. The infant mortality alone means that almost every adult in the village has lost a child or a sibling. Plagues sweep through. Storms take ships. Raiders come and don't come back. Old age, when it arrives, is both a relief and a slow farewell. The funerals are major events. The body is washed, dressed in fine clothes, laid out with grave goods, sometimes burned in a ship, sometimes buried in a mound. There are professional mourners, and there is also the genuine, private grief of people who have just lost someone they loved. Meanwhile, the rest of the household quietly carries on. The fire is rebuilt. The animals are fed. The work, brutally, is still there. And in the small continuation of daily life, the warmth of someone next to you on a cold bench, the way Astrid still sets out an extra cup at the feast for a husband who has been gone 5 years, you see the love that runs through the whole period like an underground river. It is not loud, but it is the love that, for most people, was the actual shape of their lives. And honestly, that's the kind of love that lasts. Let's talk about the trader, because we've made a lot of noise about the raider. And the trader is, statistically, far more important to the Viking economy and far more representative of the era. The Vikings were extraordinary traders. They built networks that ran from Newfoundland to Baghdad. They moved furs from the Arctic Circle, amber from the Baltic, slaves from anywhere they could capture them, walrus ivory, soapstone, falcons, weapons, and Frankish swords. Actually one of the most prized luxury items of the era. They traded for silver, silk, glass, wine, spices, and the small, beautiful objects that turn up in Viking graves and that have nothing to do with Scandinavia. A Buddha figurine in Sweden, an Irish reliquary in Norway, a coin from Samarkand in a hoard in Yorkshire. The classic Viking trader is a man called a far-farer, someone who travels far for trade. He has a gnar, the deeper-bellied trading ship, slower than the longship, but more capacious. He has a small crew. He has goods, and he has the willingness to travel for months, sometimes years, for the right deal. He travels east, often, to the great rivers of what is now Russia, the Dnieper, the Volga, and he portages his ship between river systems by rolling it on logs. He passes through trading towns, Staraya Ladoga, Novgorod, Kiev. He may go all the way to Constantinople, which the Norse called Miklagard, the great city, and trade in its markets, gawk at its domes, and possibly take service with the emperor. He may go further still, south into the Caliphate, where he meets Arab traders and is described by the famous Arab traveler Ibn Fadlan as the cleanest and the dirtiest people Ibn Fadlan has ever seen. He admires their physiques. He is horrified by their hygiene practices around shared bowls. He records, in great and uncomfortable detail, a Viking funeral he witnessed on the Volga, and his account is one of the most important primary sources we have for these rituals. We owe a tremendous debt to one curious Arab diplomat who wrote everything down. In the West, traders cross the Atlantic. They go to the Faroe Islands, then Iceland, then Greenland, then, finally, briefly, North America. Vinland sagas tell us what they found there, a green, fertile land with self-seeded wheat and wild grapes. And what drove them out? Persistent conflict with the indigenous people, who were more numerous and more determined to keep their land than the small Norse settlements could overcome. The North American adventure ends. The Greenland one persists for centuries before slowly dying out. The Iceland one becomes a thriving, idiosyncratic society that produces the sagas themselves. The trader's life is, day to day, a curious mixture of tedium and danger. There is the long boredom of the sea. There is the constant alertness on land, in foreign markets, where you are exotic and your goods are valuable, and not everyone has your interest at heart. There is the negotiation, conducted in pigeons and gestures, and the occasional word-of-mouth interpreter. There is the joy of the deal, silver counted out, goods exchanged, a successful season, and there is the long road home, always with the awareness that the sea may decide otherwise. The trader brings back not just goods, but stories. He brings back news, and news in this era travels at the speed of hulls. The big political events of the Mediterranean reach a farm in Iceland years late, transmitted by traders, embroidered in retellings, eventually settling into saga form. The trader is, in this sense, the era's journalist, its anthropologist, its accidental historian. He saw things you and your neighbors will never see, and on long winter nights, he is asked to describe them, and the descriptions become the imagined geography of a culture that, for most people, never leaves the home valley. In the end, the trader is the quiet hero of the Viking Age. He builds connections. He moves wealth. He brings the world home. The raider takes. The trader exchanges. And history, which loves drama, remembers the raider. But the trader is the one who shaped how the Vikings actually lived and how the rest of the world came, slowly, to know them. Let's talk about Iceland. Because of all the Viking projects, the settlement of Iceland is the strangest, the most successful, and the most well documented. In the 870s and 880s, a wave of settlers, many of them Norwegian, many dispossessed by Harold Fairhair's consolidation of power, many simply restless, sail west and find an empty island, geologically violent, treeless in places, but with grazing for sheep, with rivers full of salmon, with hot springs, and crucially, with no king. They claim land. They build farms. They establish, in the year 930, the Althing, the All-Island Assembly, at a dramatic site called Thingvellir, where the North American and Eurasian tectonic plates are visibly pulling apart, creating a rift valley that becomes the floor of the world's oldest functioning parliament. Icelandic society is unique. There is no king. There is no central authority. There are chieftains, but their power is contractual. Farmers can switch their allegiance from one chieftain to another, which is an extraordinary innovation for the period, and one that places real limits on chieftainly tyranny. There is the law speaker. There's the law. There is, for nearly 400 years, a self-governing republic of farmers in the middle of the North Atlantic, and it works, more or less, until it doesn't. What it produces, almost as a byproduct, is the sagas, the great body of medieval prose literature that gives us almost everything we know about the inner life of Viking-era people. Egil's Saga, Njal's Saga, Laxdæla Saga, the sagas of Icelanders, the sagas of the kings. They are sometimes funny, often violent, sometimes deeply moving, and remarkably realist for the era. They describe what a chieftain wore to a feast, what a slave said to her mistress on a particular morning, what the weather was like, the day a particular man was killed. They are not history in the strict sense. They were written down centuries after the events they describe, but they are an astonishing window into the texture of the period. Icelandic life is, by Norse standards, especially hard. The volcanic soil is thin. The growing season is brief. The winters are long. There is no native timber. Wood has to be imported or driftwood scavenged. The people learn to live on dairy, fish, and mutton. They develop skyr. They develop hangikjot, smoked lamb. They develop a very strong relationship with sheep, who outnumber them by a wide margin, even today. They develop a peculiar sense of humor, the dry, understated, slightly fatalistic comedy that you can still hear in modern Icelanders' voices. Christianity arrives in Iceland around the year 1000, in a way that is itself a saga. The Althing is split, half the country pagan, half Christian, and a civil war is brewing. The law speaker, a wise pagan named Thorgir, is asked to arbitrate. He goes off alone, lies under a cloak for an entire day and night without eating or speaking, and emerges with the ruling that the country will adopt Christianity, with the proviso that pagans may continue to worship privately. The country accepts. Iceland becomes Christian by deliberation. It is, frankly, an extraordinary moment in the history of religious conversion. You may not visit Iceland in this story, but you should know it exists, out there in the Atlantic, full of opinionated farmers and people who, on long winter nights, will be writing down everything that has happened in the entire Viking world. They are the librarians of an age. Without them, almost everything we know about your village, your jarl, your gods, your laws, your ships, your love affairs, and your ridiculous lawsuits, almost all of it would be lost. We owe them everything. In the end, Iceland is the Viking Age in concentrate. The freedom, the lawfulness, the hard winters, the dry humor, the willingness to argue about a fence for 50 years, the willingness to accept, when the time comes, that even fence arguments must give way to something larger, and the willingness, on long winter nights, to write it all down, in case anyone, 1,000 years later, should want to know. Let's talk about Greenland, because the Greenland story is one of the great quiet tragedies of the Norse world, and it deserves to be told. In the late 980s, a man named Eric the Red, exiled from Iceland for a series of killings that even Iceland, which has a high tolerance for killings, has decided is too many, sails west and finds another island, larger than Iceland, mostly icebound, but with viable fjords on the southwest coast. He winters there. He explores. He returns to Iceland, and, in a marketing move that historians have been laughing about for 1,000 years, calls the place Greenland. Because he reasons, people will be more inclined to settle a place with an attractive name. It is the first recorded act of real estate spin, and it works. He returns with 25 ships full of settlers. 14 make it. The Greenland colony is born. For about 450 years, Norse Greenland persists. It has farms, it has churches, it has a bishop, it exports walrus ivory, falcons, and sealskin. It imports timber, iron, and manufactured goods. It has at its peak perhaps 3,000 to 5,000 people in 2 main settlements. It is a real, functioning, cold, isolated outpost of European civilization, perched on the very edge of the habitable world. And then, slowly, it ends. The reasons are still debated. The climate cools. The medieval warm period gives way to the Little Ice Age, and the brief growing seasons become briefer. The pack ice expands, making the sailing route from Norway harder and more dangerous, and trade slows. The Norse stick rigidly to a European agricultural model, sheep, cattle, dairy, that becomes less and less viable as conditions worsen, while the Inuit, who arrive in northern Greenland during the same period and who hunt seal and whale, thrive. The Norse appear, from the archaeological record, to have largely refused to learn from their Inuit neighbors, even as their own way of life became impossible. By the early 1400s, the Western settlement is abandoned. By the late 1400s or early 1500s, the Eastern settlement is gone. We do not know exactly how. There are no written records of the end. There are only the empty farmhouses, the unburied dead in some cases, the strange domestic detritus of a community that simply, at some point, was no longer there. They may have starved. They may have left. They may have been absorbed into the Inuit population, although the genetic evidence is at best ambiguous. They may have died in their houses, one by one, through one final unspeakable winter. It is, in its bleak way, the most haunting episode of the Viking Age. The longships came west in the high noon of the era, and somewhere out there, in the cold, the last lights went out. The descendants of the people who sang in Bjarni's hall, who ate Astrid's cheese, who wore Ingrid's cloth, who fell asleep to Egil's stories. Some of them, somewhere, were the last Norse Greenlanders, and they faced an ending that no one back home would ever know about with any precision. Not every Viking story ends in glory or in saga. Some end in silence. Some end with the cattle dying in the byre and the snow coming in through the broken thatch. The Vikings, who launched ships into the unknown without flinching, sometimes simply did not come home. Let's talk about Vinland, because this is the one that always surprises people, and it deserves the surprise. Around the year 1000, a Norse expedition sails west from Greenland under a leader called Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, and lands somewhere on the coast of North America. They build a small settlement, winter there, return to Greenland with reports, and over the next decade or so, several more expeditions visit. They explore, they cut timber, they harvest grapes. Actually grapes, possibly wild grapes, which is part of why the place is called Vinland, Wineland. They encounter indigenous people, the Skraelings, possibly the ancestors of the Mi'kmaq or the Beothuk, and they trade with them at first and then fight with them. And the fighting, as fighting tends to do, escalates. The site has been found. In 1960, archaeologists at a place called Longship on the northern tip of Newfoundland uncovered the remains of a small Norse settlement, turf-walled buildings, iron-working evidence, distinctively Norse artifacts. The dating matches the saga. The place is real. Leif Erikson set foot in North America. The Norse made the crossing. The crossing did not stick, but it happened, and the evidence is, at this point, beyond dispute. Why didn't it stick? Mostly distance and demography. The Norse were operating at the absolute limit of their logistical reach. The supply line from Greenland was tenuous. The Greenland colony itself was small, and the local population in Vinland was both numerous and unwelcoming. There simply was not the manpower or the political will to sustain a transatlantic colony so far from home, especially when the home base was itself a fragile colony of a few thousand people on the edge of the ice. In the end, Vinland is a footnote, but it is the most spectacular footnote in the entire Viking Age. The longships went and went and went, and at some point they touched a continent that the rest of Europe did not even suspect existed. They turned around. They went home. And 5 centuries later, a man named Christopher Columbus would sail, with much more publicity, into history, and the Norse, who had been there first, would be remembered only by the people who never forgot. The saga writers, in their cold farmhouses in Iceland, writing down what their grandfathers had told them. Let's talk about the storm, because every Viking script needs a chapter where the sea decides it has opinions, and tonight is that chapter. You are aboard a longship, Bjarni's, of course, somewhere off the coast of what will eventually be Norway, on a routine summer trip to the next market town. And the weather is changing. The sky was gray when you set out. It is now black. The wind, which had been a steady following breeze, is now coming sideways, and the waves are starting to develop the kind of nervous, choppy quality that experienced sailors recognize as the sea's bad mood. Bjarni is at the steering oar. He is no longer joking. Egil, who was halfway through a story about a man who married a seal, has stopped and is securing things. The crew, including you, is bailing, using carved wooden scoops to pull water out of the bottom of the ship, which is filling steadily because the ship is open and the rain is sideways. By Viking standards, this is Tuesday. Stormy Tuesday, but Tuesday. The sail comes down. It would tear if left up. The mast is unstepped, lashed along the deck, because a tall mast in a violent crosswind is a recipe for capsizing. The rowers, you now, bend to the oars, trying to keep the ship's bow into the waves, because broaching sideways is the death of any open boat in heavy seas. There is no shelter. There is no below decks. There is no rescue. There's just the ship, the crew, and whatever you can do with what you have. You row. You bail. You row some more. The wind is screaming in a high, thin note that you cannot hear over the noise of the waves. Someone behind you is praying. To Thor, of course, because Thor is the god of farmers and sailors and ordinary people in trouble. Someone else is muttering an old charm. Egil, who has fallen overboard once and lived, is methodically tying himself to a rope and the rope to the ship. This is good seamanship. This is also what people do when they think there's a real chance the ship is going down. The storm peaks. There is a moment, about an hour in, where you genuinely believe you're going to die. You have time to think about your wife and the baby that will never know you. And you have time to think, with a kind of weird clarity, about how much you would have liked to eat Astrid's bread one more time. The wave that you think will be the last one rises up over the side, hangs there for a sickening second, and then breaks across the bow instead, and the ship rises and is still afloat. You bail harder. And then, after another hour, the wind eases, the waves drop, the clouds thin in the west, and a watery light comes through. The sail goes up, cautiously, reefed small. Bjarni steers for a beach he has been watching the whole time, a small bay he knows from years of running this coast. The ship hits sand. Everyone falls off. Everyone lives. You sit on the wet sand, soaked, freezing, shaking, and Egil hands you a horn of ale that has somehow remained unspilled in a leather sack tied to his waist, and you drink it, and it is the best ale you have ever tasted. The crew laughs. They will tell this story all winter. By next year, the storm will have gotten worse in the telling. By the year after, Egil will have personally negotiated with the sea god. By the year after that, the ship will have flown for a brief moment. This is how stories work. In the end, the storm is the reminder that everything in this world, the longhouse, the farms, the markets, the law, sits on top of a wet, unpredictable, indifferent ocean, and the ocean does not care. The Vikings made their peace with this in the only way they could, by going out anyway, and laughing about it afterward, and naming their children after the people who didn't come back. And honestly, that's the Viking Age in miniature. And honestly, that's the Viking Age in miniature. Let's talk about the funeral, because you cannot understand a culture until you understand how it handles its dead. And the Viking funeral is one of the most extraordinary phenomena in early medieval Europe. The basic shape is this. The body is washed, dressed in fine clothes, sometimes laid in a wooden chamber inside a burial mound, or, in the most spectacular cases, inside a ship. Grave goods are placed with the body. Weapons for a warrior, a spindle, and combs for a woman, tools for a craftsman, food for the journey, sometimes a sacrificed dog or horse, and, in the most extreme and uncomfortable cases recorded by Ibn Fadlan, a slave girl who has volunteered to follow her master into the afterlife and is killed in a complex, harrowing ritual that we will not detail here in any depth because there are limits to what a sleep script should contain. Suffice it to say, this happened. It is well attested. It was rare, but it happened. And the people who did it believed they were honoring the dead. And the people on whom it was done believed, in the cases where they had a choice, that they were earning a place at the high table of the gods. The burial mounds are everywhere. Travel through Scandinavia and you will see them. Round, low rises in a field, sometimes with a rune stone beside them, sometimes with no marking at all, just the swelling of the earth that signals. Here is someone who used to be alive. Some are massive royal mounds, like the Great Mound at Jelling in Denmark, raised by King Gorm and his son Harold Bluetooth. Some are modest, the resting places of farmers and their families. All of them are the answer to the same question. How do we say that this person mattered? The ship burial is the spectacle. The two great surviving examples, Oseberg and Gokstad in Norway, were dug up in the late 19th and early 20th century, and they are some of the most extraordinary archaeological finds of the Viking Age. The Oseberg ship is a richly decorated longship buried under a mound, containing the bodies of two women, one elderly, one younger, surrounded by an astonishing array of grave goods, textiles, sleds, a wagon, animal skeletons, tools. The Gokstad ship, a working warship, was buried with a single chieftain. Both ships are now in a museum, and standing next to them is one of the closest things you can get in the modern world to time travel. They carried real people, and then they carried those people one final symbolic distance. The cremation is the alternative. The body, in armor or in fine clothes, is laid on a great pyre. The pyre burns. The bones are sometimes collected afterward and buried in an urn, sometimes left to mingle with the ash. There is a saga sentence, and we keep coming back to the sagas because they are simply one of the great gifts of the period that describes a chieftain's pyre as so tall that the fire reached the heavens, and the family standing around it watching. You can imagine the smell. You can imagine the heat on your face on a winter night. You can imagine the silence afterward and the long walk home. What did they think happened next? The answer is that they had several stories, and they did not appear to be especially anxious to reconcile them. Warriors who died bravely went to Valhalla, Odin's hall, where they fought all day and feasted all night until Ragnarok. Some went to Freya in her hall Folkvanger. The gods divided them, somehow, between them. Others went to Hel, the grey underworld, which was not punishment so much as the default destination for a quiet death. Still others, in some accounts, simply lived on inside their burial mounds, occasionally visited by descendants, occasionally getting up to walk again as the Haugboy, the mound dweller, which is roughly the Viking version of a ghost and is about as unwelcome as you'd imagine. The Vikings did not have one neat afterlife. They had several. They were comfortable with the contradiction. In the end, the funeral is a community act. Everyone gathers. Everyone drinks. Everyone tells stories. The dead person, whoever they were, is named and named again, because in Viking belief, the name is a thread that holds the dead inside the world a little longer. As long as you say their name, they're not entirely gone. And the high seat in the hall, perhaps, is left empty for one night, and then for one more, and then, eventually, someone else sits in it, because the work of the living must continue. And the stories are told, and the stories are written down. And here you are, 1,000 years later, in a different bed, in a different country, hearing them. The thread is long. The thread is still holding. Let's talk about the cross, because the Viking Age does not end with a battle. It ends, mostly, with a slow, gradual transition from the old gods to the new one. And that transition is the thread we have to follow now. Christianity comes to the Norse world in stages. Missionaries arrive. Some are killed. Some are received politely. Some make converts. The kings who are watching all of this begin to notice that the rest of Europe is Christian, that Christian kings have certain advantages, diplomatic, economic, ideological, that pagan kings do not, and that frankly, the new religion has a useful structure. There is one God. There is one church. There is, conveniently, a hierarchy that places the king very near the top. The conversions are not always voluntary. Harold Bluetooth. Yes, the King the Bluetooth wireless protocol is named after, in case you were wondering, converts Denmark in the mid-10th century. And his runestone at Jelling proudly declares that he made the Danes Christian, which sounds straightforward, but in practice meant a lot of armed persuasion. Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson, saint in the making, convert Norway in a series of campaigns that mix preaching, bribery, and outright force. Sweden converts more slowly, more piecemeal, with the old religion lingering at the great temple of Uppsala until late in the 11th century, when Christian forces finally close it down. In the villages, the change is gradual. The old Thor's hammer pendants give way to small crosses, but for a long time, both are worn, sometimes side by side, sometimes by the same person, sometimes hedged by people who are not quite sure which gods are most likely to be paying attention this week. There are graves from the transition period that contain both pagan and Christian symbols. The boundary is messy. The conversion is slow. People are pragmatic, and people remember their grandparents. The church arrives physically as well. Wooden stave churches go up, with their tarred timbers and their dragon-headed gables, which, if you look at them, are remarkably similar to the prow ornaments of longships, because the same craftsmen who carved the dragons for the ships are now carving them for the churches, and the iconography blends. There are crucifixes carved with looping animals biting their own tails. There are baptismal fonts decorated with Thor fishing for the Midgard serpent. The new religion absorbs the old in 1,000 small ways, and the old leaves its fingerprints all over the new. What is lost? The public worship of the old gods is suppressed. The temples are closed. The seasonal sacrifices to Frey and Odin are forbidden. The private practice of the old religion fades over generations. The wise women, the vulvas, become harder to find. The runes become less central. The mythology, the gods, the giants, the wolf, the serpent, survives. But now, mostly as story rather than as belief. By the 12th and 13th centuries, when the sagas are written down, the writers are Christian men recording the customs of pagan ancestors, and they are sometimes troubled by what they record, but they record it anyway, and we are forever in their debt. What is kept? The legal traditions, mostly. The thing survives, in modified form, in Iceland, in the Faroes, in some local Scandinavian assemblies, all the way to the modern day. The naming traditions, the seasonal feasts, lightly Christianized. Yule becomes Christmas, slowly, with most of the old customs intact. The love of stories, the legal-mindedness, the cold, dry humor, the relationship with the sea. The Vikings did not vanish. They became something else. Norwegians, Danes, Swedes, Icelanders, the Norman French of Normandy, the Norse Gaelic of the Hebrides. But the bones of who they were stayed inside who they became. You, in your village, watch this happen across a generation. The first Christian priest who comes through is met with suspicion. The second performs a wedding in the new style, and people are surprised to find they liked it. Your grandchildren are baptized. Your great-grandchildren do not remember Thor. The change is slow and irrevocable, and from where you sit by the fire, you can feel it coming, the way old Sigurd can feel a storm in his knee. In the end, the cross does not destroy the Vikings. It simply, quietly, finishes them by turning them into the next thing. Let's talk about the long winter, because we have spent a lot of the script on summer adventures, and the truth is that the heart of the Viking year is the winter, and the heart of the winter is the long, dark, indoor month where the work slows down, the doors stay shut, and the community closes around itself like a hand. From October to March, in your latitude, the days are short, and the nights are extraordinary. The sun, by midwinter, barely gets above the horizon for more than a few hours. The cold is constant. The snow is constant. The wind is constant. The world contracts to the longhouse, the byre, the well, the path between them. This is, paradoxically, when Viking culture is at its richest. The food has been laid in, the salted fish, the smoked meat, the cheeses, the barrels of skyr, the dried herbs hanging from the rafters. The animals are inside, eating the hay you spent August cutting. The fire is fed, the lamps are lit, and the long, slow indoor season begins. The season of stories, of music, of weaving, of mending, of board games, of long political arguments, of children fighting and being separated, of old people remembering things, of young people falling in love. You play games. The Vikings had several. There is Hanefadafel, a board game where one side has a king and a few defenders trying to escape, and the other side has more attackers trying to capture him. There are dice games. There are riddle games. Riddles being a cherished form of entertainment, partly because Odin himself was famous for his riddle contests, and partly because in a long winter, anything that fills 2 hours of an evening is welcome. You sing. The harp comes out. Old songs, new songs, songs of love and battle and stupid mistakes ancestors made. You drink. You eat. You sleep when the fire is low, and you wake when someone, usually Sigurd, decides to add another log at 3 a.m, accompanied by a long story about a winter storm in his youth. You also make things. The winter is when the year's craftwork happens. Astrid weaves, long, patient hours at the loom, producing the fabric that will be made into clothes, traded at the market, given as wedding gifts. Bjarni works on a sword hilt, the design of a wolf's head emerging from the bone over weeks. Ingrid is teaching herself a new embroidery pattern. Egil is mending a fishing net. The thrall, Olaf, you have not met Olaf properly, but he is here, and he is endlessly patient, is repairing a leather strap. Children learn by watching. They're given a piece of wool and told to spin it, and they produce, in their first year, several feet of lumpy thread. They are praised anyway. They go on to make perfect thread, and you tell stories. This is the great winter occupation, and it is what makes the Vikings the Vikings. The stories are the tradition. They are the memory of the community. They are the way you teach your children about gods and heroes, about the family's lineage, about what is honorable and what is shameful. Egil tells the same stories he told last year, but they are slightly different now. And you don't know if they are different because his memory is changing, or because he is consciously editing them. Some night, a wandering skald, a professional poet, passes through, and you feed him and shelter him, and in return, he recites for you for 3 hours, and it is one of the great evenings of the year. Outside, the wind howls. Inside, the fire burns. The smoke rises through the smoke hole. The frost forms on the inside of the wooden walls in places, and you do not look at it too closely. The animals shift in the byre. The dog dreams. The cat is somewhere. You have given up trying to track her. The world is dark and small and warm, and somewhere out there, beyond the next valley, beyond the sea, beyond Iceland, beyond Greenland, the winter is the same winter. People are gathered. Fires are burning. Stories are being told. In the end, the long winter is what holds the Viking Age together. The summer is when things happen. The winter is when things are remembered. The summer is the verb. The winter is the noun. And you, lying on a wooden bench under a wool blanket, somewhere in the year 870, in the middle of a season that will not end for another 4 months, are part of that noun. You are part of the long memory. And honestly, in a world this dark and this cold, that is no small thing. Let's talk about endings, because every age must have one, and the Viking Age has a famous one. The conventional date for the end of the Viking Age is the year 1066. In September of that year, a Norwegian king named Harald Hardrada, Harold the Hard Ruler, a former commander of the Varangian Guard in Constantinople, a man who had fought in places most of his contemporaries could not even point to on a map, invades England, lands a large army in the north, and is decisively defeated by the English king Harold Godwinson at a battle called Stamford Bridge. Hardrada dies on the field. His army is shattered. The dream of a Norse North Sea empire dies with him. 3 weeks later, on the south coast, Harold Godwinson's army, exhausted from the forced march back south, is defeated in turn by William the Conqueror, who is, ironically, himself the descendant of Vikings. William is a Norman, and the Normans are the descendants of Norse settlers who took Normandy in the early 10th century, converted to Christianity, learned French, and produced a very distinctive medieval ruling class who happened to be, technically, Vikings 2 or 3 generations removed. So the Vikings, in a sense, conquer England in 1066, not the pagan, dragon-proud Vikings of legend, but their grandchildren in chainmail, speaking French and praying to the Christian God. After Stamford Bridge, large-scale Viking raids and invasions essentially cease. The Scandinavian kingdoms turn inward. They consolidate. They Christianize fully. They become medieval European kingdoms, recognizable to anyone who knows the broader pattern of medieval Europe. Feudal, Christian, monarchical, slowly bureaucratizing. The longships are still built, but they are warships now, not raiding ships. The traders continue, but they are absorbed into wider European trade networks. The settlements in Iceland, Greenland, and the British Isles persist, but they are no longer the cutting edge of an expansion. The Vikings have stopped being a thing that happens and started being a thing that happened. In your village, the change is gradual. Bjarni grows old. Astrid grows old. They are buried in mounds with the rites of the new religion, but with the old grave goods set quietly beside them. Their son rules in the hall. Their grandson rules after him. The thing meets every summer, but its power is shrinking. The king, far away, claims more and more authority. The taxes go up. The independence of the carls erodes. Slowly, over generations, the old structures are absorbed into the larger structure of the kingdom. The longhouse becomes smaller. The byre is moved out. The sleeping platforms become beds. The smoke hole becomes a chimney. The Viking world is becoming a medieval world, and the people inside it barely notice, because change of this kind is always invisible from the inside. What's left? The names. The place names in northern England, Whitby, Grimsby, Selby, Derby, all the by-endings, which is Norse for town. The place names in Normandy, the Norse loanwords in English, sky, leg, knife, take, give, husband, window, ugly, happy, want, get, hit, sister. You speak Old Norse every day and you do not know it. The legal traditions in Iceland and the Faroes, the architectural fingerprints in stave churches, the genetic fingerprints in modern populations from Dublin to Kiev, the sagas, beautifully preserved in their 13th century manuscripts. The runestones, scattered across the Scandinavian landscape, still bearing the names of men and women who lived 1,000 years ago, and wanted, when they died, for someone to know they had been there. The Viking Age does not end in a battle, really. It ends in a long, slow merging, the way one season merges into the next. There is no moment of, now it is over. There are just generations of small adjustments, until one day someone realizes that no one in the village has put to sea in living memory, and the longship in the boathouse has rotted, and the great hall has been replaced by a smaller, warmer house with a chimney, and the children no longer know who Thor is, except as a half-remembered figure from old stories. In the end, every age ends like this. The drama is at the start and the middle. The end is just the long fade. And the Vikings, who lived in such a vivid, noisy, salt and smoke and iron world, faded as quietly as anyone into the deep sleep of history. And on a wool blanket, in a long house, with the fire dying low, that's the kind of ending that, eventually, comes for all of us. So here you are, still warm, still breathing, still on whatever soft surface has been carrying you through this long and improbable story. You have spent the night in a longhouse that smelled of smoke and fish and animals. You have woken to a frosty morning, eaten porridge, met Bjarni and Astrid and Ingrid and old Sigurd and toothless Egil. You have stood at the edge of the fjord and watched the longships come in. You have rowed through a storm. You have attended a wedding and a funeral and a thing where a man recited the entire law from memory. You have crossed an ocean. You have set foot in Vinland. You have watched Greenland slowly slip into silence. You have heard a skald sing in the dark hall. And you have, somewhere along the way, begun to understand a world that is older than nearly everything you know. And now, gently, you are going to set those people down. Bjarni and Astrid had their lives, and they lived them. Egil told his stories until his last winter, and somewhere, the people who loved him still tell them. Ingrid married her young man and had 4 children. Old Sigurd died in his sleep in his 91st winter and was found by his grandson and was buried with his whittling knife. Ravensol lived to be 12, which is a long life for a Viking dog, and was buried at the edge of the field. The cat was found, eventually, in the byre, curled up next to a lamb. They were real people, in the sense that millions of people exactly like them existed. They lived hard, and they laughed, and they loved each other, and they survived a great many things that you and I would not survive. And some things they did not survive either. But while they lived, they were here, and they made a world out of the cold and the smoke and the sea. And we are still living in some of the rooms they built. And now think, for a moment, about where you actually are. You are not in a longhouse. You are in a bed, with sheets that have been washed in the last week, under a roof that does not leak, in a room where the air is not actively trying to make you cough. Your dinner was not salted fish. Or fine, it might have been, but it was your choice, not your only option. You have running water. You have antibiotics waiting in a cabinet. You have a roof you do not personally have to thatch. You have a thermostat. You have a light that you can turn on with a fingertip, and the light does not require a small clay lamp full of fish oil. You have, in this very moment, comforts that even a Viking jarl with all his rings could not have imagined. And you are, maybe for the first time tonight, noticing them. History does not have lessons exactly, but it has reminders. It reminds you that people have always been the same people. Same humor, same fears, same need to be loved, same exhaustion at the end of the year, same affection for animals, same complaints about the weather. The Vikings were not monsters, and they were not heroes, and they were not better than us, and they were not worse than us. They were us in a colder house, with worse teeth, doing what they could with what they had, and finding small reasons to laugh while they did it. And in 1,000 years, someone will tell stories about us, about how we lived, what we ate, what we feared, what we loved, and they will be just as wrong about us in some ways, and just as right about us in others, and the thread will keep going. So now, close your eyes. The fire is low, the storm has passed, the longship is pulled up on the beach and tied to a post. The dog is dreaming somewhere. The cat is, as always, in charge. Bjarni and Astrid are asleep in the high seat. Egil is snoring with great dignity. The wind outside has dropped to a soft, low hum, like a fan, like the one in your room, like the one running gently next to you right now. You are warm. You are safe. You are not in a longhouse. You are home. The Viking Age is over. The story is done. You did beautifully. Sleep well. Good night.